Well, thank you for everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Amy Torres, and I'm an intern with Aspen Family Wellness Center. And here at Aspen, Katie and our team, we work to train life coaches as well as provide education tools, coaching and counseling for families and individuals. And one of the things we're going to do for my internship is put this webinar together. And I'm so excited to be able to collaborate with Melissa and learn what she has to share with us and to offer. So just before I introduce Melissa and before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you can keep your microphones muted so there's not a lot of feedback. If you have questions during the presentation, if you want, you can put them in the chat bar. And as they come up, we'll bring them up during it, and then we'll have time for additional ones at the end. Today, we are so excited to have Melissa with us. Melissa, if you don't know, is from Life Helper for You. She is here to help us learn more about how to understand and cope with loss in our lives. Melissa has a degree in marriage and family studies from BYU, Idaho, and she is a board certified life coach who has training specific to grief coaching and significant life experience as well. I have really enjoyed getting to know more about Melissa and what it is that got her into this field by learning more about her. Melissa's bio said that her life was transformed because of the helpers that have crossed her path throughout life. And some of those helpers throughout her life have been people, where others have been knowledge that she's obtained through education to help her through the difficulties that she's faced. She says that through the difficult times in her life, she's been grateful for the many helpers who have been there to aid her family through difficult times. And because of her life experiences, she has a strong desire to help others, whether they are grieving a loss or wanting to improve their lives. Drawing upon her strengths has enabled her to become more resilient to the challenges that she faces. We are so excited to have her share her knowledge and experience with us tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the time over to Melissa James.
Thank you, Amy. Appreciate those kind words and telling people a little bit about myself. I'll go ahead and start with sharing my screen. In 2009, my oldest son died from a very rare cancer called adrenal cortical carcinoma. And at that time, wow, that just threw us for a loop. That whole, everything that we went through with that, and then when he passed away. And I realized that understanding about grief and loss really can make a big difference in how you can cope with that. And I had this desire to learn and share more with others. So I want to be a little bit vulnerable right now about some of the losses I'm having right now in my life, because maybe you have some of them as well right now. In March, my mother passed away, and it wasn't from coronavirus, but we were impacted by that and weren't able to have a regular funeral or, viewings and different things like that. The whole way that we mourn with other people was kind of not really there. And so that was a hard thing to go through. I also, in January, had a daughter that got married. February, I had a son that got married. And now, even though those are happy events, there's an element of loss with that as well, because I don't have the same relationship with those two kids that I did before. I have to adjust and shift with that, and there's kind of stress that goes along with that. I'm realizing. So there's been kind of a lot happening right then, and then all of the stuff with the coronavirus that's been happening as well. So anyway, I'm grateful for the knowledge that I've had about loss, because even though I am not immune to it, the struggles that come with it, I can understand it better, and I'm able to take control with that. And so as we go through this, I might refer a little bit to some of the things that are happening with me right now, but just wanted to let you know about that a little bit. Okay, so let's see. Oh, okay. I couldn't figure out. Didn't seem like it was moving for a minute. Okay, so first I wanted to start with understanding about loss. And then that'll be part one, and then part two will be about coping. When we understand what's happening to us, it can make a really big difference in and being able to find meaning in what's going on and not feel like you're going wacko or crazy, or maybe feeling bad about yourself because you're not functioning as well as what you think you should be doing. So first I want to talk a little bit about what grief is. So grief, you can see, I'm not going to read through this whole definition. You can read through it while I'm talking, but sometimes we think about grief as mostly being with losing a loved one, but it can be over affliction or any kind of loss. Um, Even like moving to a new place, that's a loss. And you might feel some grief, but you may not label it that way. You know, so sometimes if you just realize that a lot of the things you might be experiencing might be grief whenever you have a big life change. Okay. So a loss happens when you're deprived of something or someone as well. It always comes with change. So when I mentioned about like my kids getting married, that's where some of that loss comes with that. And it's also a natural part of our lives, and we'll have loss over and over and over. So some of the losses that we might have will be significant, hopefully not too many of them, but we'll have lots of smaller losses. And right now, with the coronavirus and all the changes involved with that, a lot of people are experiencing lots of smaller losses. Some might be major, but when we're kind of having all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people with a pile up of different kinds of losses, then, you know, that's a struggle. And so people we interact with might be as well, who might be struggling. And, you know, that can cause maybe some issues at times. Okay, so I'm going to go over different types of losses. And as I go over that, you may think about some that maybe you have. And if anybody wants to share in the chat as I talk about it, you know, if you just want to write in there that you're having this kind of loss or something, then that would be fine if you want to do that. Okay. Okay, so first off is non-death loss. So that is a loss in any of these areas. So physical, there could be, you know, loss in health, loss in maybe you're having, you were diagnosed with diabetes or any sorts of diseases or things like that. Okay, so right now there's probably people that are experiencing that may have had physical things from the coronavirus that might have occurred, or even maybe not being able to get to a gym and exercise when you were doing that before could be somewhat of a physical loss. Psychological losses can happen. Spiritual loss. Sometimes people will struggle with maybe faith, and that's a type of loss. And interpersonal types of losses as well. So as you think about that, maybe some of the losses maybe you might be feeling right now could fall into some of these categories. Okay, secondary loss is really interesting. And when I learned about this, it just really opened my eye. I had a great big aha moment because I noticed after our son died, we had a lot of secondary losses. And I kept thinking to myself, man, why are we having so many of these things happen to us? But when you have a really big primary loss, secondary losses almost are going to come along with them. And it can feel kind of like, why this? I've already had this other big loss. Why am I having all these other things happen? So it's important to realize that secondary losses happen. They're called secondary because they come from the primary loss. It doesn't mean they're small necessarily. They may be small or they may be really, really big. So an example could be if there's a divorce. So, you know, that would be like the primary loss. And then maybe you'll find that you lost your home because of the divorce. Maybe you'd lose your friends. The children would lose having an intact family, you know, on and on. And so there's all sorts of losses that could come from that, and they can be very significant, and some of them might be smaller. Oh, and so if you have noticed that you have secondary losses from a primary loss, then first of all, it's helpful to identify that it is a loss and to recognize that. And then like you can go through and you could write down your different losses that you notice and write how that's impacted you. and then go ahead and write about that, if that makes sense, to help you to process through it, because you need to process each of those separately if you want to have healing. So I notice there's some chats coming in, but I can't see how to how to get to them. Amy, can you see them?
Uh-huh.
And do you want
So
to read them
Melissa,
to us? Okay.
Nicole said that recently separated and moved out of state.
Mm,
She thought it was interesting that you said it was a loss when you move, and it made
mhm,
her think differently about that. And then Paul made a comment about in his experience, an activating loss will create most of these things that we're talking about, that you're talking about.
mhm. Okay, yes, thank you. Appreciate your comments. Okay. All right, ambiguous loss. Now I'm going to read this little quote here because I couldn't find a better way to say it myself. Ambiguous loss happens when something or someone profoundly changes or disappears. A person feels torn between hope things will return to normal and the looming sense that life as they knew it is fading away like a Polaroid developing in reverse. So I thought that was really poetic. So like, for example, somebody is kidnapped maybe, or a prisoner of war. That would be a really extreme ambiguous loss. Because you're always going to be hoping, you know, that they'll be found. And sometimes we read stories about people that are, and you hope for that, but you just don't have closure. And so those are like really hard losses. But other ambiguous losses could occur when maybe a loved one develops dementia, or suppose you have somebody close to you that is struggling with mental illness or other sorts of things like that. Somebody maybe that you're living with in your home and they've really changed, and that can be hard. Sorry, did somebody say something? Okay, I think I just heard something, but okay. So I think that one of the things that's really hard about ambiguous loss is the fact that it is ambiguous. You may have hope, but you don't have that closure that happens like with the loss from death. And people often, they may feel like they don't get support for some of those things as well too, to recognize that there is a loss there. Okay, do we have some more in the chat? Okay.
Oh, let's see. Dina says she's currently helping her father with dementia.
Mm.
He also has a type of schizophrenia that she's trying to cope with that ambiguous loss.
Yeah, so that sounds really hard. I'm sorry to hear that. Um, th those are really hard things to deal with, and it's helpful if you realize that that is a loss that people are going through, and to be able to be supportive and validate people when they're going through it, and just to realize this is a loss. So that is really hard. Okay, cumulative loss. So as I mentioned before, I've had kind of a lot of losses in my life, and a lot of them have been smaller, but with, well, in the last few months, a lot of losses, especially, I mean, but so that's multiple losses in a short amount of time. And I think there's a lot of people that are going through that right now. One thing in our family that we're struggling with is how to have everybody function well in a smaller space, because we're not used to everyone having to do everything there at the same time. And I think this is a very common thing that a lot of people are going through right now. And so we keep trying to rearrange things and trying to figure it out. But I was really struggling not having space during the day that I used to have a little bit. And so um, finally, when I was realizing, actually, as I was putting this together, I thought, oh, I think this is because of all this cumulative loss, that I'm struggling just to be as productive and things like that. So another thing that you can have with cumulative loss is experiencing a new loss while you're still grieving a past one. So there's probably people right now that have a significant loss that they're going through, that they had just recently gone through, and then they're getting piled on with all these other losses. And so cumulative losses, that they're hard because they're on top of each other. Or it could get quite extreme, like maybe somebody's lost several family members in an accident or in a natural disaster or things like that. So it can really range in of course, all of these losses in their extremity.
Melissa,
Yes.
Nicole brings up an experience. She says when her son was diagnosed with autism, it has really changed, was a type of a loss, even though it
Uh-huh.
hasn't changed a lot. It's kind of, that loss of a certain type of lifestyle.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing about that, Nicole. That kind of goes on really well with this one right here, the non-finite loss, the loss of hopes and dreams. Some of these losses can fit in more than one category. So I chose this picture of an empty swing when someone's maybe wanting a child and hasn't been able to have a child. That would be an example of the loss of hopes and dreams. Or like Nicole's example, when you have hopes and dreams for your child and they're not going to be able to achieve those, it's hard. It's, and of course people don't necessarily look at you and think you're suffering with a loss because they just, they can't see that that's that loss of your hopes. Um, a lot of times people that have loss of a non-finite loss where they've lost hopes and dreams, they'll keep hoping that it will happen because a lot of times there still is some hope that it would happen. Maybe if somebody's hoping to be married, then they still might keep hoping about it coming, or hope to have a baby, or different things like that, or hope for a child who's wayward, or whatever it may be. And so that's another one because there is that element of it could change. It doesn't have an end, even though maybe they seem smaller than some losses, like, if somebody being killed or something like that. It's kind of like it's ongoing and you're always reminded of it. So that can be pretty hard and unrecognized.
Melissa, Scott brought up the point, The Odd Life of Timothy Green is a fantastic movie about this type of loss.
Hmm. What was it called again?
The
Odd
Odd
Life?
Life of Timothy Green, which is a really good movie, and it emphasizes that a lot. And as you were talking about that, I thought about, I have a sister-in-law who tried for a long time to have kids. And the problem sometimes with this type of loss and hope and dreams is people don't see it maybe as a
Mm-hmm.
loss, but you're still trying to cope with it. And so trying to
Mm-hmm.
cope with that when other people don't see it as that type of loss is also a
Yes.
problem when you're trying to cope with it.
Yes, I think so. And I think sometimes when people talk about it, they may get poo-pooed about it, like, well, maybe you should be glad you don't have children. Look at the ones that are causing me problems, or, whatever it may be. I think it's really not validated a lot of times. Was there another comment that popped up? I saw a little.
Scott shared a link for The Odd Life.
Oh, okay. 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 Thank you.
It's just a really fun movie, and it illustrates your point well. And
Uh-huh.
it's a positive, upbeat movie too. If you haven't seen it, you really should.
Yeah. Well, if I can get to the point where I can see the link again, then I'll try to
Okay.
I'll try to get it or bug you about it later. Okay, thank you. All right, we'll go on to the next one. Anticipatory grief. I imagine you're probably kind of familiar with this one. So this one, our family had this when our son was dying. Um, it kind of makes it so your grief is spread out a little bit more, but it doesn't make it so that you don't feel bad when they die. Does that make sense? It still hits you and it's still shocking. Um, after our son died, there was a person from my church whose husband had died and he had actually been killed. And so it was like super shocking for her, when that happened. And we had a little discussion one day, and she said she was surprised about the grief, that it wasn't easier for us, if that makes sense. It's just spread out, but the grief is hard no matter how it happens. But when things come really shocking, then it can be really hard for a shorter amount of time. Does that make sense? Or, well, I mean, it might go on, but when people have anticipatory grief, they may be grieving for really, really long, and they're taking care of the person too. And they're also seeing how the person's capacity has changed. So like in this picture with this little girl, her family would then be dealing with all the loss that occurs before she dies, you know, from having to have whatever cancer or whatever it is that she has there. Um, I just thought of something I'll just share that was very tender about a child with cancer. When our son had cancer, we were getting some blood tests done. And there was this little girl. You couldn't tell she was a girl because she was bald, but she had on a beautiful dress and she was getting blood work done too. And this older gentleman started dancing with her in the waiting room while there was a volunteer playing the piano. And it was so touching to see that, you know, that love. I assume maybe it was her grandfather, I don't know. Anyway, but just seeing that love there for that little girl and that she could still enjoy life because everyone waiting there was all kind of down in the dumps, you know, because they all had cancer. And it was just a beautiful thing. But anyway, so anticipatory grief, that will happen while you're anticipating a loss, and it's still, as I was saying, it still is hard. It's just different in some ways. And I think when you have that also as that little girl dancing, you get the opportunity to appreciate the person and the life you have. So in some ways it's a blessing to be able to go through that, and you also get a chance to say goodbye. And so it does have its positives.
So Melissa, Echo said that I would think there's a lot of stress to carry with this type of loss. Her mom had ALS, and as she declined, she knew she was going to pass, but it was a lot to carry that around.
Yes, yes, it is a lot. It's a heavy stress that just doing that whole thing, going through it. I know my brother-in-law actually passed away from ALS, and he went through many years with that, and it was really hard on his family. And so then you're already kind of worn down from taking care of the person and all the stress with it. And then when the loss comes, a lot of times you're already kind of at a low place. So it can be pretty hard for a lot of those sorts of situations. Okay, so disenfranchised grief is kind of an interesting one. That's when you're like denied the right to grieve. So this, of course, can be on a spectrum as well. One example could be that maybe a woman is having an affair with a man who dies. And so she's not going to be publicly recognized as someone who's grieving. So that would be really hard. Or maybe somebody in a same-sex relationship that isn't recognized by all of their family, or different things like that. I did a grief seminar once where I think a woman was in a same-sex relationship, and there was another man there that kept talking about his wife that died over and over and over. And she was, I think he wanted to engage her with it, feeling the same way, but I could tell she was feeling kind of disenfranchised with it. She didn't feel comfortable just to talk about it, you know, and so those are kind of more extreme ones, but I think it can also be any time when maybe somebody feels like we shouldn't be grieving, that it's not that big of a deal. That could maybe be part of it as well. But what it leads to is feeling alienated, invalidated, and ashamed. So those are things to keep in mind if you find that someone is grieving, but people aren't recognizing them. Or if you experience that and recognize that it is grief, and maybe try to find someone who will listen to you if your family won't, to be able to process that. Okay, is there another chat that's come up?
Dina, sorry if I mispronounced your name, says, I think that's what happened to her today. I don't know.
So that's hard. Yeah, you know, we all need to feel validated with what we're going through. And I think, you know, even like, I guess what comes to my mind right now is when I broke up with a boyfriend when I was 18. And boy, I was crying a lot. It hit me really hard. And after a while, my mom's like, will you just stop that crying? And she'd always been really sympathetic with me, but I think she just got really tired of it and felt like I should have been able to move on, you know? So sometimes when younger people too go through something hard, and people that have had more experience have maybe gone through similar things, we sometimes maybe treat them that way a little bit, you know? And even children.
I was going to say, Melissa, when you talk about being validated, how important that is for adults and for younger children. when we validate those feelings that people are feeling, even if we don't agree with it or we don't feel the same way, is we validate it, it helps people to cope with that grief or the problem they're dealing with.
Right. Yes. Okay. Is there another one that came in?
Echo said a child whose parents going through a divorce is a good example of that,
Yeah.
that type of grief.
Yeah. Thank you, Echo. That's for sure. Yeah. And a lot of times maybe people are thinking about the parents, but not about the children when they're going through it. And okay. Is there another one that just came in? I have the screen kind of pop down and then go back up and showing a number sometimes.
You're good. Nicole pointed out that like when a child loses a balloon, that is probably the hardest thing for them.
That's true.
Validate those feelings because it's big to
Yeah,
them.
it is big to them. Yeah. Yeah. That's for sure. Is there another one that just came in?
Or when your 19-year-old son's fish dies.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, all of those things, that it's kind of interesting how we could maybe cause somebody to have a little disenfranchised grief if we're not, kind of trying to be there for them in the moment. Okay, thanks everybody for your great comments. Okay, so I want to now share a little bit from the Holmes Raw, I don't know how you say that, RAHE, Life Stress Inventory, and try to show you the connection between grief and stress, okay? So this is a well-recognized inventory of stressful events. I believe there's like 43 things that are listed on there. And I just kind of wrote down some of them that I thought maybe people might be going through right now with the coronavirus things. And I didn't write them all down because I ran out of room. But I think like, for example, a death of a spouse or family member or close friend is probably going to be not as common as some of the others, and the major illness, if we just connect it all back to that. But we may find a lot of changes in the health or behavior of a family member from this. The gaining a new family member, I wrote that down because I've heard of a lot of people that have had their young adult children move back into home. And that's hard on those young adult children that come back in, and they're losing kind of their college dreams and things like that. But it's also hard on the family sometimes when they've been used to having this adult child who's living their own life, have to come back in, and then everyone's trying to get along again. And sometimes maybe there's not room in the house for everybody. So there are a lot of people that are struggling with that. Many people are struggling with changes in their financial state right now, which is a really, really hard one to go through. Many major changes in working hours or conditions. Changes in social activities and family get-togethers and recreation. Doesn't that just all fit along with what many people are going through? And I wrote changing to a new school because so many people are maybe still in the same school, but they're doing online school instead. And so that's a big stress for people. And all of those have an element of loss in there. So later on in the presentation, I have a link to this inventory. And if you want to there's a link one for it. You can go to a website and you can go through and take the assessment, or you can print up a PDF and do it on your own. But it actually has, when you total up the score on it, then like the higher your score is, the more likely you might have like a stress-related illness that would come. And so it is important to maybe try to see how much stress you're having from your loss. And if you're having a lot, you might, need to make sure that you're taking care of the stress the best that you can.
Melissa, as you look at this list, it's amazing how many of these things can be happening all in these last 3 months.
Right.
And as I thought about, like my husband was furloughed for a bit and we've had changes in work activities, and my son hasn't been able to play football, and doing homeschool as a parent while doing school myself, man, it's amazing how those things really do add up when you look at this list, and how family members, you really do need to work together as family because these do compound and can put a lot of stress on a family.
Yes, they do, for sure. Yeah, so if you feel like you're not functioning very well, give yourself a little bit of a break and a little self-hug because you're probably having a lot of losses that might be happening right now for you or your family members. And it's hard too if you know family members might be struggling, especially. It's hard to, you know, figure out how to help them and support them. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about normal symptoms of grief and stress. So I really like the fact that this grief/stress, these are same symptoms that can happen with stress, just stress in general, but also with grief, because grief is a stress response, if that makes sense. So when you think about that, then if you're having grief from loss, then you can think about what kind of things would you do to alleviate stress, and that helps with these things. So when our son died, I thought what I would feel was going to be crying all the time. And I remember my mom would sometimes call and she'd say, "How's your depression?" I said, "I don't feel depressed, I feel sad." You know, but we think of like sadness and depression as what grief is, and that's what we're expecting from people. We may also feel like maybe there's going to be some anger or things like that too. But there's a lot more than just the emotional things. So I'm going to just talk about maybe some of the more common ones, but there's a lot more than what I will say, because there's like long lists of things that can happen. But for physical, you may have like an appetite change, sleep changes, weight changes, and restlessness. Some people may feel a desire to increase use of alcohol, drugs or tobacco, some of those sorts of things. So when our son died, I noticed that like I couldn't sleep very well. And I've been having struggles again, like now with that somewhat too. So physical changes will be there, you know, that you're going to experience. So for emotional, and that's the one maybe we might expect more, but things like anxiety, frustration, mood swings, crying spells, irritability. I have been a bit irritable lately with everyone at home, I have to admit. That's one that I'm doing. Anger, guilt, maybe we might feel hopelessness or worrying a lot. Mentally, we might get forgetful, have poor concentration, low productivity, confusion, or lack of motivation. Those are some that I have noticed, lack of motivation and low productivity. I feel kind of like I'm just trying and trying and my wheels are spinning, but I'm just not very productive, you know, and then that's frustrating when you feel those sorts of ways. So for relational ones, and this can really vary depending on what type of loss you have. So like right now we might feel it a lot since so much of the social distancing is relational. So we're probably going to feel a lot of these sorts of things, but you may feel like a sense of isolation or intolerance or loneliness. Hiding. I feel a little bit like I'm hiding when I'm wearing a mask, and I don't want to go out and about when I have to wear a mask because it feels kind of like that. We may have fewer contacts, and so you may also have a desire for others to reach out to you, but on the other hand, you may also have a desire to be left alone, or one or the other. So a lot of those can happen relationally. Spiritually, people that have had significant loss will often feel emptiness. Many of them will have a loss of faith. They can feel doubt and loss of direction. So when you feel any of these sorts of symptoms, it's important to kind of recognize that maybe they're coming along with loss, and give yourself a little bit of a break in how you maybe talk to yourself about what you expect from yourself. Because when you are going through a lot, it takes a long time to process these sorts of things and for you to become adjusted to it. And so you're going to have the effects with that. Okay. So now we're going to talk about coping. All right, so just to start off, remember, as I mentioned earlier, grief is a normal stress response. And I really like the second quote here, or this quote here that says, "Stress occurs when the perceived pressure exceeds your perceived ability to cope." So that means that if it's our perceptions, how we see things are going to be unique from each other. And it's important not to be judgmental of ourselves or judgmental of others if we think that maybe they're not holding up to the pressures very well, or that maybe somebody else handles it so well and we aren't, or whatever it may be. but it has to do with a perception. And so it's good to realize what your perception is of what's happening, and realize that maybe that's going to be different than your spouse or your children or other people around you, what their perception is. And then after you see what your perception is, then you can find ways to try to cope with it better. So these are just some things for managing stress symptoms. It's not a complete list or anything, and they're all probably a lot of things that maybe you've heard about before. I'd like to just mention a few things that I ran across about things that you can do that have to do with mindfulness during times of crisis and challenge especially. Now, I tried this one with my daughter. This is called a 3-breath hug. My daughter's 10, and I think this was embarrassing to her, and she giggled the whole time. So this could be something that might be useful for someone, but maybe other people, it might feel really weird. But I'm just going to share it in case it's useful, because I think it's kind of a neat thing. But this is called a 3-breath hug, and it might be really good in a really severe crisis. But it's when you get you and other people that you're close to, you like hug each other, and then you do 3 deep breaths together. And so, like, for example, if a child's going through something really hard, they can feel kind of wrapped up in love and help to relieve their stress. You know, so I think it can bring families together if they're willing to do it. However, if you haven't been doing anything like that before and they're a little bit older, they may think that's just really weird. But if you're like, if somebody's just died or something, I think maybe a lot of people would be really open to it. But anyway, I just wanted to share that in case it's helpful for anybody with their families. Another one that I read about too, and I have been saying this ever since I read this the other day. It's a mindful mantra, and it is this too, which means this too is like allowed and accepted. So one thing that we feel is like we don't want to have this happening to us, and so we feel resistance, and we don't want to have the pain, we don't want to have suffering that's happening, we want it to go away, and we may say, why is this happening to me? Or it's not fair, this shouldn't be happening to me. And when we have those kind of thoughts, then it just makes it worse. You have, it becomes more stressful when you have that. But what helps is when we can accept what is happening. If it's something that we can't change, acceptance is a better path to go down. So when you say this too, maybe just like some deep breathing, and this too, it's short, as long as you know what you're saying that it's about, and it helps you with accepting it, what's happening. And so, so I've just been doing it. It does, it helps soften the resistance that you feel. So that's an idea, or come up with your own that you might want to say to help you to just kind of get through it when you're going through kind of some hard things with that. So the rest of the things on here, I think probably most people can do that. And there's just a lot of things that we can do to manage stress, and it's not really exactly what I'm trying to focus on, but anyway, I'll go forward. Okay.
Melissa, really quick before
Yes.
going on,
Yeah.
you said resistance a couple times, and I really like that, because when we are stressed, we do tend to resist those things. Even though we know these, we've heard them, we've seen them before, it's nice to be reminded that those things really do help us when we're resisting, you know, wanting to change or knowing how to change. So I think those are really good, that's good advice on how to help cope with that stress.
I think if you're going through something really hard and you keep finding that you're saying why this, why that, or whatever, when that why word comes up, it might be related to resistance. I mean, there is some benefit if we're really wanting to understand why something's happening, but usually when we say why, it's more whining, I think. So, you know, check yourself if you're hearing yourself say that, and which kind of why it is, or, you know, you're trying to get to.
Too?
Yes.
So this is like the parable of the arrow by the Buddha. And I've shared this a lot recently in the Authors of Life group that we have with Aspen. And basically in this parable, the first arrow that hits you is the event that's happening. So for this context, it's loss. And then he talks about the second arrow being our response. And just like you said with the resistance, when we resist, it makes it more painful than if we accept. And so, as well as asking why, it's when you say, you know, no, I don't want this to happen to me. Why me? Why is this piling on top of each other, like you've already mentioned? And so we feel tight in our body. We end up feeling the emotions on such a deeper level. Yet when you create space to say, okay, this is happening, I can't change it, but I can grow through it, I can be present with it. It's almost magical in the sense of you create this space to accept. And when you accept, that's when you're saying that phrase like this too, or yes. And there was this study along with it where a counselor, he had a room of people and he shouted, he said, he asked them to close their eyes and he shouted, no, no, no. And he asked the group, how did they feel when he said that? And people said, I felt tight, I didn't like it, I felt restricted, I felt like a child when the parent says no. And he said, okay, close your eyes again. And he just whispered really gently, yes, yes, yes. And then he asked, how did they feel now? And it was the complete opposite, peaceful, gentle. The feelings before had been lifted. And so it's not like we are accepting in the sense of, you know, that bad thing happened to me or whatever it may be. We're just accepting that we can't change it. And so we are dealing with what we're going through and creating that space for acceptance, which I really love. And I love how you're delivering basically what that parable is. And it's so beautiful.
Oh, thank you for sharing about that. That's great. So yes would be a great mantra. I love that. I think thinking up thoughts of gratitude go along with that as well. You know, that it changes your whole perception if you can find something good in what you're going through. Okay, so now I'm going to share a little bit with you about Podesky's rings. So on this little model here, you can see that each of these circles, the arrows go back and forth between each other all over. They all impact each other. This can be used in two different ways. The first is that you can see that the different parts of when you're having stress, how it affects the other parts of your body. You know, your thoughts, the way your body feels, your behavior, your emotions. I often carry a lot of stress in my shoulders. I went through a period of time actually where I could hardly move my jaw. It was a really stressful time in my life. I couldn't eat an apple. It just hurt too much because my muscles had I carried so much stress there. And so I had to start going to this deep tissue massage therapist, and boy, it hurt so bad. I had to take pain reliever before I'd go, so she could release those muscles, you know, and get myself changed from that. So sometimes another, you know, maybe we ignore some of those things or the behaviors maybe that come with it. Like I find that I'll eat more snacks when I feel stressed. You know, so if we identify that the behaviors or our body or our thoughts or emotions, that they're all connected with that stress, then it can be really helpful to see how we can change. And we can make plans to change and goals and things of how to work with each of those areas. The second way this can be used is that what will happen is that these, usually one or two maybe of these bubbles may get a lot bigger than the other ones. And so they will stand out. And as you identify that, like when I had my jaw hurting a lot, that became really big. I actually had my emotions were really big at that time too with that as well. And so that can help you to see how out of balance you are. And so try to get yourself back into balance, setting, you know, you're identifying something and then you can come up with brainstorming and coming up with ways to solve that or help alleviate it or make it better. So this can be a helpful little model to use in that way. Okay, so for healing, it's really important that you give yourself time. So even though, like, I know a lot about loss, I've still had loss and I've still gone through a lot of this. So but I need to be able to accept that I had that loss, as the first step shows there. And that's one of the steps. I have to go through that even though I understand it. It just helps make it easier if you understand what's happening. You need to allow yourself to experience the pain. And that's the part we don't really want to do a lot of times. Acceptance helps us. When we accept it, then we're able to say, okay, I'm going to feel this pain. When you're going through something really hard, it doesn't mean you need to be feeling the pain all of the time. You know, you can go and you can journal or something about what you're experiencing, and the pain can be more acute, and then you can take breaks from it, because we can't, if it's something really, really hard, we can't just stay there in the pain, but we do need to experience it to be able to have healing and go through that. And then adjusting to your new life circumstances. That's what our family is trying to do right now. We're trying to change the way we do things so that we can, you know, have a better outcome and be able to cope better, and then finding new ways to live. And in just a minute, I'll talk a little bit more about some of that. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about helps for processing grief. Writing things down is really, really a positive thing, because there's something that comes from the connection with your head and your feelings and writing it that's really therapeutic. A lot of people find processing grief helps through photography or maybe art or music or things like that. Doing projects is another way some people process grief. That's what my dad's been doing. He's been doing all sorts of projects since my mom died. You know, he's just going gung-ho on it. But his strength isn't as good. He's always liked to do projects, but he doesn't have as much strength. So one way that we've been supporting him is helping him do his projects so that he can be able to still feel that and go, and it helps him to process it, that we can support him with it. So talking to a listener, and when I say that, that means someone who's just going to listen, listen and accept, not listen and judge or listen and dismiss, but someone who can just listen to you as you process through it. Sometimes you may have feelings of anger or things like that. And so you need to be able to have someone that can be able to accept that you might have unpleasant things that you might need to get off your chest. Another thing is like doing gardening or housework or things like that. Those that can help us with processing grief. Okay, so now we're on to rebuilding your life. So with every loss, there's an opportunity to build a better life. You've got your systems have changed or things like that, and you have a choice of how to rebuild that. So this is going to be like, if you've suffered something significant, you may not get to this point for a while. And so don't try to just jump into that, you know, a week after someone died or something, but it can be an opportunity to build your life. So ways that you can do this is you can examine what your values are. In another slide, I've got a link for an assessment that you can take that's really, it gets pretty deep about what your values are. It's a free assessment, and then it gives you results and how you might apply that to your life. There's also, you can go through lists of different values and just pick your values. There's a lot of different ways that you might find your values, or think through your life about what's been meaningful to you over time. And then after you examine what your values are, ask yourself if your life is aligned with your values. And if it is, that's great. And if not, what can you do to change it? And then also your strengths can go along with that too. Usually your values are connected to what your strengths are. So if you live a life where you're trying to use your strengths, you're going to feel more aligned and more fulfilled. So you can find ways. There's some strengths assessments you can take. I put some links also in some resources. And then you can think to yourself, how can I use this strength in a new way today? Or you could wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to use this certain strength. What can I do? And so as you kind of combine those, you can think about what kind of life do you want to build? And if you're thinking about it as an opportunity, instead of I'm not happy with this life, you'll start to feel some excitement as you do that more, because this is a time that you can make changes. Maybe you're going to say, I'm not going to do all these games of soccer with my kids because that was really, really hard. I'm not trying to tell anyone to do that or anything, but you know, you can look at those things in your life and decide what you want to do. In our family, I've decided I wanted to try to play games with my daughter more. And as the family too, but especially my 10-year-old daughter. And so we got a little basket and we put games in it that are fast and easy to play, and so then we can play them in 10 minutes or something. And she's really enjoyed that, you know, and it's been fun for me too to interact with her in a fun way. I think we've been having some chats come up.
Yes, when you were talking at the first about it's an opportunity to build a better life, Nicole said exactly where she's at, exclamation point.
Mm.
And then Paul would like to know if the slides will be available so that they can access that and be able to have these reminders for the things that they can do.
So I have, what I was thinking was to put my slides in a little PDF that has like maybe 4 slides to a page. So in one of the slides coming up, it has my email. So if you want to take my email, then if you send me an email and ask what you would want, like the slides or whatever, then I'll send them to you. Does that sound okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Uh-huh. Is that all of the chats or any more?
Uh-huh.
Okay. All right. Okay, so here's some resources right here. So these will be in the slides, or if you want to take a picture or something like that with that. The stress inventory, there's a link that you can go to and you can go through and click on it and go through it online, the stress inventory, or they have the PDF. I don't know if you can see this. This is a copy of the PDF right here. So it's just on one page. And then you put your score on the side and you total it up. So that's pretty easy to do that. But I didn't do the assessment one, but I did see it was available. Anyway, so those are the resources that I told you about. And then this has got my information here, if you want to see that. So the last slide just has the resources that I use, but do we have any questions while we're here? I know we're getting close to the hour mark.
Melissa, I'm just wondering, you know, of all the things that can be helpful when you're helping somebody through this, what would you say are the top 1 or 2 skills as a coach that would be most crucial?
Oh, well, I guess a good way to think about this is to be like a companion. So if you break down the word companion, com means with, and then pan means like to break bread. So, well, it means bread. So if you think of like being with someone as you're breaking bread with them or sharing a meal with them, like you're on the same wavelength, you know, you're treating them like as a friend, you're treating them like you just want to know what they have to say and you're listening to them. On the other hand, treating a patient means the treating is like, I'm trying to remember what the word is in Latin, but it means it's kind of like you're dragging someone. And then the patient is like a long-suffering person. So if you think about that in contrast, those 2 different images of you're not judging with the first one, but the other one you're telling them what to do. So don't do that. Just be there for them. I like to think about like the phrase mourn with those that mourn. I like to think of the word with as being really, really important, even though we don't usually think of with as being important. But it's just being there with somebody and accepting them for what they feel, accepting them if they're going to be maybe angry or guilty, and not try to solve it, but just to listen to them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other thoughts? Oh, and a wonderful video about that is Brene Brown's video about empathy, because that's what that whole thing is about.
Especially the animated version.
What's that?
Somebody animated it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that one. Yeah, if you just watch that, that's a wonderful guide for helping anybody with anything that's hard that they're going through.
Yeah. My question was kind of related to you know, when Scott was asking about coaching is a lot of what you presented here, I would almost call what a grief counselor does.
Uh-huh.
And my focus since graduating has been on kind of creating a resilience framework at, at the family level. And yet a person who might be participating in something I'm doing, they're the only person we can affect, and then they're supposed to take that effect home to their family.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
But I would no more ask you to take home something to your family while you're grieving than I would ask you to carry a 400-pound brick. And so I'm wondering, how do we kind of step into this role, because we're, as coaches, we're not counselors. We're,
Right.
we have to come at it from a peer framework.
Mm-hmm.
But yet we do have these assessments that we can use to help someone. And I'm trying to picture how to, if you put on your BCC hat, how do we
Put it together, like helping a grieving family. Is that what
yeah.
you're trying to do? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, so I guess things that you could do are give the person some ideas of what they could do with their family. For example, I have two different sets of cards that can help people that are grieving. One is one where it goes through kind of like what you need at first to what you need later. Little things, just one little thing to think about each day. And so you could do that as a family, possibly together, have a conversation. Another one is called, let's see, what is it? Something garden. But it's like the cards all have flowers on them, and they're useful for support groups or for families. And so they might say things like, what is a memory of your loved one in this situation? They have all sorts of different things, and then it kind of gets people talking together.
So maybe kind of present a little bit of an activities framework that just gives them the opportunity.
If there's children, especially like that, or the other alternative is meeting together in a session. So that it can depend on people's willingness and things like that. That does bring up more things to think about when that happens. But when you do come together, you could go through and do some of that together with them. The little cards. The one card's called, I think they're called healing cards. But if you're interested in either of those two resources, if you send me an email, I can tell you what they are. I have them in another part of the house because I have relocated where I'm working from upstairs to downstairs. So yeah, so there's like little things like that you could do. Another thing you could do even is, those little things that say, how are you feeling today, and have little faces on it. You can do that with a family. So maybe you might find that, Paul Jr. is feeling really angry, and Sally is really sad, or you know what I mean? So you can see where the different people in your family might be.
And we actually had some other questions too. Sorry, I'm trying to find it. Paula brought up, that this was very eye-opening for her, as whether we're a coach or, just someone that's trying to understand grief and coping. This has been, really eye-opening, I believe, for all of us. And there's a lot of great resources that were shared. One question Jennifer did ask is, if we can maybe quickly touch on it, is how can you help someone not be the victim of grief?
Not be the victim, is that what you said? So I guess sometimes there's a fine line a little bit there when people need to talk, and then when they want to stay there, right? And I'm not sure the answer for that. Maybe they need to be in a therapist
Yeah,
situation.
And I think some of your last slides actually do go over that really well, helping them to rebuild their life and examine their values and things like that helps put that in a different perspective.
Yeah, and if you can maybe just even ask them some questions, like, ask a question like, well, if you could have whatever life you want now, I know it's not going to be maybe with your loved one, but what would you want your life to look like? And then I think that can get them out of the victim mode.
And it's great.
They're
Well,
feeling that way.
I want to thank everyone that came and joined. And Melissa, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and knowledge with us.
Oh, thank you.
Again, for anyone who is interested, please call Melissa or email her, go to her website to see what services and offer, things that she does offer that can help you. And I just want to thank you all again for coming, and I hope you join us for our next webinar that will be in July that we'll be sending out information about.
Thank you. And can I just tell